If you wanted to open your Bibles to John chapter 12, you are welcome to do so. We just started last week looking at John chapter 11 and John chapter 12, which is when Jesus turns his focus towards Jerusalem, towards the cross, and when the Pharisees and teachers of the law turn their focus towards killing Jesus. And so, in our preparation towards Easter, we're walking through these two chapters. In chapter 12, begins with a story that happens at a meal, which is so fitting for our fellowship lunch Sunday, right? We're going to be at the very same location here at the beginning of chapter 12 as we were in chapter 11 last week. We're going to be back with Lazarus at his home in Bethany. Remember, Bethany is a little town just outside of Jerusalem, right? If you did your homework last Sunday was to read John chapter 11, you might remember that in verse 54 it says that Jesus left Bethany and Jesus and his disciples left. Well, now they're coming back a few days later. So we're in the same place. And we're with the same people again. We're with Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha and the disciples and Jesus, and they're all together again. Now, before we read that story and dive into the details, let's step back and ask a broader question about these two chapters here. It's a question that's really good to keep in mind as you read the Bible. I want us to ask the question, why did John put these two stories side by side in his gospel? Right? When you read the Bible, my Bible has chapter breaks and verse breaks that when I read the Bible, I get to the end of a chapter, I think, okay, I should stop there, right? Well, the original story never had those breaks. And so John didn't separate chapters 11 and chapters 12 from each other and say, there, now take a break and stop and then come back to it later. No, he laid these stories side by side to keep reading them, right? Why did he put them side by side? Sometimes the Gospels are chronological, tells a story in time order, but not always. The writers sometimes move things around a little bit because they wanted specific stories, themes, side by side. John clearly links last week's story and this week's story by the location and by the people. But I think he had a greater purpose than that, than just, hey, it's the same people, it's the same place, let's tell these stories side by side. He had a bigger purpose, a bigger theme in mind when he set these two stories side by side. Right, so we're heading towards the cross, and then since we're heading towards the cross, we're also heading towards the empty tomb and the salvation story that Jesus brings. And so John had in mind last week with chapter 11, the resurrection of Lazarus. He had in mind to teach us, to prepare us for how Jesus comes to us. How Jesus comes to us with his saving grace and his salvation message, right? If you were here last week, you know he came to Lazarus. He came to that brokenness. He came to Mary and Martha with great compassion. Remember, he wept in front of Lazarus' tomb. Even though he knew that Lazarus was about to be raised from the dead, he still felt with Mary, Martha, cried with them. He comes to you and to me, filled with compassion, filled with empathy, experiencing the pain and the sorrow, not just dismissing it, but saying, I'm here with you. I hurt with you. And then we saw he not only came with compassion, but he came with power. He not only feels our pain, but he does something about it, right? He stood outside of Lazarus' tomb and he roared, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus came out. And Mary and Martha's tears were turned to joy. Death was turned to life. And that's what Jesus does for us today. He comes with compassion, and then he does something about the hurt that he feels with you. He brings you strength. He brings you wholeness. He brings you healing. He brings you what you need for each day with his power. Okay, so that's how Jesus comes to us, with compassion and with power. And now, with this next story we're about to read, John teaches us how we come to Jesus. Because it has to be a two-way street in a relationship, right? We need to also come to him. How do we do that? How do we step into a relationship with Jesus, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Well, John shows us how to do that. Listen to this story. John chapter 12, 1 through 11. I had a nice kids book last week. Don't have a kids book for this story. Sorry about that. So just listen, follow along if you wish, to John chapter 12. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who is later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. All right, did you notice as we read this story that Jesus really isn't the central character in this story? He's pretty passive here, isn't he? I'm not sure he ever stands up in this story. He's mostly observing and watching. Mary is the central character in this story. We get to see what she does and how she acts. And so really, in many ways, it's a story about us, of what we do and how we act in the presence of Jesus, right? So let's look at what she does. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus host this special celebration, this special dinner in honor of Jesus, who raised their brother from the dead. If ever there's a good reason to have a party, that sounds like a good reason to have a party. And so they host this dinner for Jesus and the disciples, and Jesus is the guest of honor here. And it's helpful to understand some details about how a dinner party like this would work. Right? What would happen if you went to somebody's house for dinner? When you arrived, first of all, you would show up at the door and there would be a bucket of water and a towel there for you. Because the roads are dusty, the roads are dirty. You probably walked a ways to get there in your sandals and your feet are dirty. So the first thing you do is you step in and you'd wash your feet. If your hosts were wealthy, they would have a servant there for you who would wash your feet for you. It's an important thing to know because they didn't sit at a table and chairs like we do, like we're going to do in just a few moments, right? Instead, we read here that they reclined at the table. They reclined, which is kind of like laying down, right? Which is exactly what they did. The table would be this low table to the floor, and everybody would take their place around the table and lay down. And you'd lay down with your left elbow supporting you, so your right hand was free to eat. I found somebody's picture of what it might have looked like. Everybody laying down, everybody's left elbow down on the floor or on the table holding them up, so you're free to eat with your right hand. That's what it means to recline at the table. And if you notice, their feet aren't hidden under the table. It's good to wash your feet because your feet are away from the food, but not too far away from the food. And so you want to have your clean feet, which is why they would wash when you came in. And so we know there's at least 16 people at this party. The disciples and Jesus, Mary, Martha, Lazarus. The dinner party begins. They're having a great time. They're probably well into their dinner with conversation and laughter and stories being told. And they're eating their good food. They're drinking their wine. And suddenly the whole room goes silent when Mary stands up and begins to move. And we see Mary do 3 things in this story. The first thing she does is she goes to, oops, I don't mean to do that, sorry. She goes to Jesus' feet and she washes his feet. This is not normal. This was supposed to be done when you first walked in the door, right? Not here around the dinner table. And certainly not supposed to be done by Mary. This is, washing somebody's feet is the most humbling of the household tasks that could possibly be done. So if you were the servant of a wealthy person, if you were the lowest servant, you got assigned washing the feet because nobody wanted to wash people's feet. I'm trying to think of what that would be like today. Can I get a volunteer to go clean the toilets? Who wants to clean the toilets here? Ew. Not really your favorite job, probably. That would be washing feet. Nobody wants to do it. In fact, we're going to find out as we get closer to Easter. You're going to see the disciples. Remember when they go to the Passover room that they rented to have Passover with Jesus? And they walk in, it's a rented room, and when they walk in, there's the bucket of water, and there's the towel for somebody to wash feet. Remember who does it? Jesus does, because none of them would do it. None of them are going to be humble enough to go and wash each other's feet. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. None of them willing. Mary here is willing. She chooses to completely humble herself. And she lets everyone in the room see her status. Really, she's declaring her status before Jesus. Here am I. I am the lowest servant of all the servants. I am your slave. That's who I am. And it's impossible for them not to notice what she's doing because what she does is she washes his feet not with water, but with perfume. And the smell of this perfume, as John says, filled the whole room. And this perfume, Judas points out, is extremely expensive. She pours out this jar of perfume that costs a year's wages. Imagine something that you own that costs whatever you make in a year, and you just dump it out. Give it away. It's gone now. That's a lot. That's expensive stuff. That perfume was probably Mary's most valuable possession. It was her greatest treasure that she was saving for just the right moment, for just the most special occasion ever. And for her, Jesus is that most special occasion ever. She doesn't pour out a little bit. She pours it all out and, like water, washes his feet with her hands and this perfume. And then, as if that wasn't enough, we're told that she undoes her hair and she dries his feet off. She lowers her head right down by his feet and dries his feet off with her hair. which in that culture, any respectable woman would never let her hair down in public. You just don't do that. And here Mary lets her hair down, bows her face right down at his feet. She leaves all of her respect, all of her honor behind, lays it all down at Jesus' feet. Any single one of those three actions would have been enough to stun the people watching. Any one of them was radical. All three of them together? Shocking. I don't think we can comprehend how shocking this actually was for them. To have a friend and the host doing the work of a servant, washing feet. To see this very expensive perfume poured out like water. And then to see such a personal and public humiliation when she let down her hair. Stunned. All except for one person. Jesus wasn't stunned. He's not stunned. This is how Mary comes to Jesus. And it's kind of what he expected. And he honors her for it. I think there's a couple of really important lessons for us to learn for ourselves of how we come to Jesus. Now we can see from Mary, from what she does. And what we see Mary doing here is we see her coming to Jesus completely honest about her own unworthiness. She is totally honest about who she is in the presence of Jesus. I mean, think about it. She could have claimed some level of worth and value and honor, right? After all, we know that she is one of Jesus' best friends. We know that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are Jesus' best friends. Their home is the closest thing to home that Jesus had. We know that when he needed a break, he would go there. And that's where he could feel at home and know he belonged. And so she could come to him as a respected and honored friend. Here I am, Jesus, your friend, the one who hosts you, the one that you love. Or she could have come to him to be recognized and celebrated as the host of the party, right? This is her party. This is her home. It's her food that they're eating. It's her wine that they're drinking. She could come to him as the host to be thanked, to be celebrated. Great party, Mary. Thank you so much for hosting. She could have come with some dignity, honor, demanded some respect. But Mary is completely honest, and she knows better. She knows who she is in Jesus' presence. She knows that Jesus deserves so much more than however much she can offer him. She knows that whatever honor and respect she might claim for herself is meaningless before Jesus. Mary is honest about how unworthy she is to have Jesus in her home, in her life. And so in profound honesty, she pours out everything she has and everything she is. Her status, her most valuable possessions, her respect. She pours it all out. She empties everything at Jesus' feet. That's true honesty. And I'll admit, my guess is you're not unlike me. It's difficult to be honest about my own unworthiness. We often like to think we fall into the trap of believing that we can impress Jesus a little bit, at least a little bit, right? That somehow I've earned the right to step into Jesus' presence, to sit with him at the table and to recline there. That I belong there because of who I am, right? We're pretty good people, doing good work for him, right? We volunteer in the church. We're doing good for things for our family, for our neighbors, for our co-workers, our friends, and all that goodness should count for something, right? Jesus should be impressed with me. I'm generous, right? I give generously for his kingdom purposes. That's got to deserve some credit for that sacrifice that I make. Not perfect, but I cleaned up my life pretty good. I'm better than most people in this world, and certainly Jesus looks at that and is impressed with me and says, yeah, you deserve to come. The truth is what Mary models. The truth about me is what Paul writes. All of my good works, all of these things that I think are going to impress Jesus so much and say, you deserve to be here. What does Paul say? They're garbage. They're garbage. They're worthless. Mary knows whatever she has to offer is worthless. Because coming into Jesus' presence, coming into a relationship with him, does not depend on anything that we have done. It's all about what Jesus has done. It's all about his amazing grace that we sang about. Nothing that I do, nothing that I have done, no possession that I own, nothing that I am makes me worthy to come into the presence of Jesus. Right? That's a right that none of us can earn. I don't care how good you are. We don't earn the right to come into the presence of Jesus Christ. Before Jesus, our status, my status, your status, is like Mary's. We are the lowest of the servants. We are the lowest of the slaves. And my prized possession is worthy of just being dumped out before him. And all of my honor and respectability doesn't impress him at all. Lay it all down at his feet. What impresses him? If you want to impress Jesus, what impresses him is humility. Humility. There is zero pride in what Mary does here in this story, isn't there? Right? She humbly declares that she deserves nothing. She humbly offers everything without expectation. She humbly pours herself out at Jesus' feet out of gratitude and love. And that honest and humble heart is what Jesus loves and what Jesus honors in this story. Because what Jesus does in this story is he rises to her defense, right? We hear Judas. Judas who looks at the amount that perfume costs and says, oh, wait a minute. We should have sold that. Think of all the good things we could have done with the money. And if you're tempted just to say it was just Judas, if you read the story in Luke's gospel, all the disciples joined in. It says all the disciples rebuked her sharply. So they're all in there, okay? And Jesus rises to her defense. Jesus holds her honesty and her humility up as something for them to imitate. You should be more like Mary, he says. This is a good thing that she's done. Because that kind of honesty and that kind of humility is exactly what we need if we are going to come into the presence of Jesus, if we are going to step into a relationship with him. if we are going to be able to receive the gift of forgiveness and salvation that he's going to the cross to win for you, that he's walking out of the tomb to give to you. Mary models what Jesus taught, and the disciples, he taught this to the disciples again and again. They never understood it. It's the honest and the humble who find Jesus, not the worthy and the powerful. If you read through the Gospels, you're going to find that in the book of Matthew, 2 times, Jesus specifically invites people to come to him. There's only 2 times where he says, I want these people to come. Here's who they are. Matthew 11:28. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You can step into my presence if you're weary and heavy laden, if you've been humbled by this world. The second time, Matthew chapter 19, he says, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belong the kingdom of God. Right? Children who have not earned that right, they are unworthy, with nothing to offer, and says, that's who can come. The humble and the unworthy. It's when you and I honestly admit that we are weary and burdened and powerless on our own. It's when we humbly admit that we're like children. I've got nothing good to offer you. I'm unworthy. That's when we can come to Jesus. That's when we can come and he says, here's my forgiveness. Here's my grace. Welcome into a relationship with me. I'm glad that you're here. And it isn't just Mary who calls us to that humility. It's what Jesus himself modeled, isn't it? Look at what Jesus did. Jesus, God himself, right, who humbled himself completely. He stepped out of the glory of heaven to live on this earth. And he stepped out of divinity to be a human being. And he left his glorious life to die a horrible death. He poured himself out completely before God the Father for us, to save us. And because he was willing to humble himself completely, God glorified him completely. Right? And now Jesus invites us to follow not just Mary's example, but his own example as well. He says, imitate me. So when we humble ourselves completely before him, honestly confess our unworthiness, admit that I've got nothing to offer but love, it's then that we will be glorified with Jesus. Because it's through grace alone that you and I are welcomed into his presence, that we are welcomed home. And then it's out of gratitude, it's out of love that we then serve him. Not so that we're filled with pride. No. Out of humility we serve. We pour out all that we have. We pour out all that we are for his glory. And so if you hear nothing else this morning, from this story, I want you to hear the voice of Jesus saying, come to me. Come to me. You're welcome in my presence, in a relationship with me. And you don't need to be good enough. Because he knows that none of us are good enough. You're not good enough. I'm not good enough. We're never going to be good enough. And he still says, come to me. Be humble enough to admit that you're unworthy. Be humble enough to accept your status as a servant. And I'll honor you. I will welcome you home. Remember, Jesus loves you for who you are, not for what you do. Let me end with this verse. Jesus said to us, he said, the greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And those who humble themselves will be exalted. Sitting at Jesus' feet, Mary modeled for us how to be exalted. And when our humility brings us to sit at Jesus' feet, brings us to sit at the foot of the cross, that's when we will receive forgiveness and grace that will raise us up, that will exalt